Hi there. This is a lecture on Moritz Schlick's On the Meaning of Life. So here's a brief outline of what I'm going to cover in this lecture. We'll start by talking a little bit about the issue in general and the framework, which for Schlick is the contemporary world. Then he has a number of insights in the piece, and we'll go through those. We'll look at what it means to deepen our understanding of play, and notice that play is not just the acquisition of pleasure or the seeking of pleasure, but there's something more like joy involved. Finally, he'll move towards discussing how play and youth are connected, and he'll raise an objection that some have made against this idea that life's meaning is play, and he'll reply to it. And then finally, we'll come back to what he thinks are sort of the larger social, cultural lessons from thinking about life's meaning as centered on play. Introduction. Now, not everyone asks, what is the meaning of life? For example, children don't. But most others who do, Schlick refers to as seekers, including those who have failed to meet their goals. The question which arises is, how can we find a unitary meaning? After all, experience is fleeting, and we find ourselves often in a strange contradiction between achieving things and enjoying them, but not seeing how these can remain permanent. In other words, we might reach a goal and find that we are bored. This is something that Schopenhauer and Tolstoy both observed. Nietzsche took a first step against this idea of meaning in his work. He wrote, "This freedom and heavenly brightness I set over all things as an azure dome, when I taught that above them and in them there willeth no eternal will." So Nietzsche here is saying, there is no ultimate purpose beyond our life, or even within our life, and our freedom begins with our confronting this fact. The question Schlick turns to next is, well, how does our culture view work? Is work important? Why? And what are some of the different views that we hear expressed about the reasons that it's important to work, or what we think of people or countries that don't work hard? Who's to blame when there's not enough work to go around? So Schlick notes that we really idolize work, and work means goal seeking, right? Because there's a goal, then you have a purpose. And so why do we work? We have a goal of maintaining our life. Now, if you ask the further question, why maintain life? The answer is almost never, so I can work more. So we have to find an answer to why we maintain life. Tolstoy understood this. We all seek meaning in our lives, and we seek a meaning that is beyond mere subsistence or existence. As the saying goes in the article, for mere living, pure existence as such is certainly valueless. It must also have a content. The first insight Schlick brings to this issue is that work has a purpose outside itself. And he says that it's characteristic of work that it has a purpose outside itself, and it's not performed for its own sake. We need ends in life and not just means to ends. And so if you think about our culture's work message, the way it's made to be the highest virtue, it's actually quite a perverse kind of idea, because nearly every work activity that we do is valuable, mostly because of further goals. A second insight he has is that the purpose beyond work cannot just be pleasure. The kind of purpose which lies outside of work can't be mere pleasure because, as he points out, Schopenhauer understood, pleasure just results in satisfaction, which then becomes boring, and then you have a new quest to find more pleasure. And so we have to find an activity where the purpose or the value of the activity is already inherent or built into it. And he says, the core and ultimate value of life can lie only in such states as exist for their own sake and carry their satisfaction in themselves. Now, such states are undoubtedly given in the pleasure feelings which terminate the fulfillment of a volition and accompanying the gratifying of a desire. But if we sought to derive the value of existence from these moments, in which life's pressure is momentarily halted, we should at once become ensnared in that argument of Schopenhauer's, which displays to us not the meaning, but the absurdity of life." End quote. And he says further, We must seek for activities which carry their own purpose and value within. If such activities exist, then in them the seemingly divided is reconciled. The third insight is that there are activities which are meaningful in themselves, and we can call them play. So by play he means a free action which has no further purpose than itself. So play in this philosophical sense is not restricted to age, and he says a life of play might be compared to an endless crossword puzzle in which new words are constantly being found and connected so that an ever larger area is progressively filled in with no other aim but that of going on further without a halt. So play is, for Schiller and Schlick, the essential state of human beings. So think about it. Do you agree? Why is play important to you? Does it reveal us more truly than other activities? Think hard about why play is so important to us. His fourth insight is that play is not totally opposed to productivity. Play doesn't have to be the permanent opposite of work. We have to find out how to make work as much like play as possible. So if play is any activity that's done for its own sake, it's possible for such activity to be useful or valuable economically too. And this is really a moral imperative. To exist meaningfully, we have to find out how to make play also productive. So some easy examples of this might be the musician who both plays and entertains at the same time, or the scientist who discovers things, enjoys that, and solves practical problems too. Now some harder examples, maybe from an older day, might be tilling the field or weaving fabrics, or you might think of working at a toll booth or something like that, cobbling shoes. And he notes that all of these kinds of activities can become play. If they can become play, they can take on the character of an almost artistic act. But in any case, work becomes play when one can get lost in the rhythm of a task, maybe be absorbed in the movement, the sheer joy of creation, or a dedication to the activity. But he says there are some activities that are just impossible to make into play. Very, very mechanical or routine work that's brutalizing or degrading. And in these kinds of cases, if we have a society that has jobs like this, that's brutal, that's mechanical or routine or degrading, we have to really scrutinize as an ethical society whether or not these jobs or what they produce are really, really needed. Because if they don't serve a very serious purpose, if it's just maybe serving the purposes of empty luxury, then we should get rid of these kinds of jobs. We're ethically sort of bound to do that if we've understood that the meaning of life is play. The fifth insight is that contemporary economic life is not really oriented towards value. Today, most of our activity is done for some distant purpose. It's unpleasurable. It's unjustified in itself. We work for the weekend, or we work so we can retire. And people recognize this on a gut level. They understand that the idea that we should worship work of this kind is idolatry. It's unimaginable, right? It's imaginable, but it's just, no one believes it. So Schlick strongly condemns societies which have large workforces doing meaningless jobs just to create luxuries, because he thinks that such economic systems are premised on the idea that it's morally acceptable to make the lives of some people miserable so that others can just have pleasure. And his point is that such a lifestyle not only exploits others and deprives them of meaning, but it doesn't lead to meaning for the privileged either. Massive economic wealth is not an aid to meaning. It's diversionary of meaning. Meaning for humans is a deep quest. It's not necessarily animalistic or pleasure-seeking or consumption-based enterprise. And so it really doesn't require the kind of expensive or extensive entertainments and titillations that the current economy produces, but that also produces so much misery and lack of meaning for so many people. Deepening our understanding of what play is and is not comes next in his piece. And he says that play can be understood as the meaning of life if we understand the following. Play must replace the curse of purposes which so often traps us. Purpose and duty can actually harm us. We can take them too seriously. Play leads to meaning through joy and not through mere pleasure. And the best examples of play are found in youth. But play need not be restricted to the young, and some young people actually lose their ability to play very early in their lives. Understanding play can help us better understand youth. Youth is really not premature or incomplete as many think, but is actually a phase with its own values and perfections. We need not give up morality if we pursue play in life and think of the meaning of life as play. But in fact, culture and education must adjust their missions to suit the need for meaning and play. So play has to replace the curse of purposes which traps us, he says. This is an interesting idea. And he says about this in the piece, he can shake off the curse of purposes and liberate his vision from the blight of cares without lessening the boon of his hopes. No specific goal stands there as an end to be necessarily attained, so that the whole road would be meaningless if it were not. Every point, rather, of the whole road already has its own intrinsic meaning, like a mountain path that offers sublime views at every step and new enchantments at every turn, whether it may lead to a summit or not." End quote. So in this vision, we set goals for ourselves as we live, but we don't worship goals. Goals add meaningful structure to life, but they do not add ultimacy. So purpose and duty, he also recognizes, and this is another counterintuitive idea initially, is that purpose and duty can harm us. Being dutiful sounds good, but all work and no play makes us narrow and takes away from the freedom that we need for self-development. So there's an important distinction involved in play, and that is the difference between joy and pleasure. Play leads to meaning through joy and not through mere pleasure, he says. He's realistic. He understands that he's offering an aspiration, a vision of what would be ideal. But he also knows that when we do have time to play, we need to make sure that we're actually playing. And this is why he has this distinction between mere pleasure on the one hand and joy. So think about what's similar between pleasure and joy and what's different. And I've put together a little table to sort of describe some of the differences. So just take a look at that for a few minutes. Pleasure on the left and joy on the right. He notices that the important distinction involved in play is also connected with youth. The meaning of life is thus in the activity of play, and not in every moment of life, of course, but in certain kinds of moments. And because play happens most often in youth, he wants to understand why the young are often the most playful. And the reason he thinks is that the young don't really worry so much about purposes. He says, youth, on the contrary, does not really care about purposes. If one collapses, another is quickly built up. Goals are merely an invitation to rush in and fight, and this enterprising ardor is the true fulfillment of the youthful spirit. The enthusiasm of youth, it is basically what the Greeks called eros, is deed, not the goal. This act, this way of acting, is true play. End quote. So the key here is to understand what youth is all about, at least what it is about in terms of play. And if we understand play, we can understand youth better, and then if we understand youth better, we can help remove some of the age restrictions that contemporary society places on play. So our common conception about the young is that they are pre-adults, right? They're incomplete. But he says this is wrong. Young people are not premature or incomplete. Youth are simply in a phase with their own values, their own perfections, and many of these values and perfections are oriented towards that present. He says a young life is not only going to receive its value from the future, but bears it within itself. So those who don't understand what youth is are almost like medieval religious minds. And he says about such thinking, anyone denying this and regarding youth as a mere introduction and prelude to real life commits the same error that beclouded the medieval view of human existence. He shifts life's center of gravity forwards into the future. Just as the majority of religions, discontented with earthly life, are wont to transfer the meaning of existence out of this life and into a hereafter. Now he raises the objection based on morality. And the idea is that, listen, we can't make life just play. That's crazy. Then we won't be moral people. We'll do whatever we feel like. So the objection more formally is that some worry that if we pursue play, people will not act morally. And so we need things like duty, responsibility, seriousness in order to be moral. And serious duty is the opposite of play. And that's the objection. And the reply to this objection goes something like this. Look, the truly moral person does not need to follow rules or obey duty in this very strict sense. They would be naturally and joyfully good people. And so he says, quote, "We do not call him the best man who is obliged unceasingly to resist his own impulses and is constantly at war with his own desires. We say this, rather, of the man whose inclinations are kindly and benevolent from the start, so that he simply doesn't fall into doubt and self-conflict." End quote. In other words, trying to force people to be moral is just a sign that they already have the wrong sort of habits. And it just makes them small and unimaginative when you try to force them that way. We make lists of duties, we create small, goal-driven, unimaginative type of people. And you might think about this in terms of like the kinds of students who give up on a desire to learn and create new things in order to choose a very practical goal. They sort of snuff something out in themselves. They find it more difficult to be authentic in the present. And the same is true with morality. It's very difficult to be a moral person in the present if your whole outlook is to look to the future to be a good person or to be thought of in the future as a good person. It's not authentic. So morality cannot just be a box to check off or to avoid guilt. Morality has to be a much more natural and sort of spontaneous way of being in the world. So we come now to the conclusion of the piece, a sort of more general exhortation on Schlick's part that culture and education reorient itself towards this different idea of what makes life meaningful, the idea that play is the key to a meaningful life. And he says that our culture, our education must adjust their mission to suit this need. To live more meaningfully, we must not undervalue the depth of feeling in youth and in play. We must cultivate play in ourselves while we can, because such play becomes part of who we are and is a resource for us forever. It makes us who we are. So we must understand that our ability to play is our most important development, and that this development is its own end. So Schlick's cultural aspiration is, quote, "Our whole culture will have to be focused on a rejuvenation of man, rejuvenation in the philosophical sense that all our doings become increasingly liberated from the domination of purposes, that even the actions necessary for life are turned into play," end quote. It must also reorient our educational missions. He says, quote, "All education should take care that nothing of the child in man is lost as he matures, that the separation of adolescence from adulthood is increasingly obliterated, so that the man remains a boy until his last years and the woman a girl, in spite of being a mother. If we need a rule in life, let it be this: preserve the spirit of youth, for it is the meaning of life." So this concludes this short presentation on Moritz Schlick's On the Meaning of Life. I hope it was useful and helpful to you, and I look forward to discussing it with you very soon.